Well, thank you very much, Alistair, and thank you very much to Georgia Tech for the kind invitation to allow me to speak to you today on the theme of Europe, a little ahead of Europe Day, as Alistair said. And I'd like to thank Cedric Sousman and Vicky Birchfield in particular for organizing this opportunity. I've had only a brief moment to drive around your fantastic campus and to understand a little of the work that goes on here. I think Georgia Tech and the EU perhaps have something in common in that, if I understand correctly, Georgia Tech was part of the reconstruction effort of the South after the Civil War, and to a certain extent the European Union, not even to a certain extent, to a very large extent, the European Union was Europe's reconstruction attempt after two disastrous civil wars which turned into global conflagrations in the last century. I'm here in Washington almost 6 months. And I suppose every ambassador likes to say that they take up their post at an interesting time. But I'm afraid the times we live in are infinitely more interesting than we would ever have wished them to be, if I use the Chinese sense of that word. Quite literally, I think we are going through a dramatic change in the international environment. And frankly, the tectonic plates are shifting. And I suspect that 10 or 15 years from now, history will look back on this period and make judgments about how we dealt with some of the most challenging international crises that the global community has had to face in living memory. And much of this, unfortunately, is happening in Europe's neighborhood. To the east, we have the very serious situation which results from Russia's activities in Ukraine. President Putin has basically torn up the rule book of European security architecture so painstakingly put in place after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. I never thought I would live to see in my lifetime the annexation of part of a European country by another country. I never thought that we would live to see the extent of Russian interference in the sovereignty of Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. But this is what we have. And frankly, the policy of trying to make Russia a good citizen of the international communities after the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has been the focal point not only of European foreign policy, but I think also of American since then, has really been failed. And we have to accept that we have to deal with a new Russia, which poses new challenges. And we have to do this while at the same time acknowledging that Russia remains an important international actor, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and an important player in many international situations, whether that's Iran or the Middle East, just to mention two. So we face a very challenging situation in our developing relations with Russia. We have put faith in the Minsk Agreement, Minsk II, the second attempt. We hope that this can lead to a political and diplomatic outcome of this very, very difficult situation. But we wait, the jury is out, and we will wait to see in the end of the year whether it is possible to bring to completion those agreements negotiated by Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande on behalf of the European Union with President Poroshenko and President Putin. In the meantime, it's absolutely clear the European sanctions and the American sanctions will remain in place until we have full proof of Russia's good faith in the implementation of these agreements. To the south, we've had the Arab awakening, which for a brief moment seemed a moment of hope and opportunity. Unfortunately, it has, frankly, gone rather sour in many countries, and it has created a period of unprecedented instability, most in Libya, but all across the region, Egypt, and of course it has connected with the events in further to the east, Iraq and Syria. The Syria crisis, the Syrian civil war, is probably the greatest humanitarian crisis we have seen in living memory globally, with several million people dispossessed and displaced, causing huge instability in neighboring countries, notably Jordan and Turkey. The European Union is the largest contributor of humanitarian assistance to this problem, but of course this is a palliative. We need to somehow find a way of addressing the fundamental issue of how to restore proper democratic government and security in Syria, but this is proving very challenging for all the reasons that we know, including the reluctance of some members of the Security Council, in particular China and Russia, to authorize any intervention by the international community, based on the feeling that when this was authorized for Libya, the mandate was perhaps not fully respected. So we have this very terrible civil war continuing in Syria with all the consequences that we know. We have the instability now in Yemen, and of course we have the rise of ISIS, Daesh, not only in Iraq and Syria and now spreading into Yemen, but frankly a virtual arc of instability spreading right down into Africa, including in Nigeria and in Mali, where there are also huge challenges, and barely a day goes by but that a new crisis arises in Africa, which is a continent which on the one hand holds out huge opportunities, but on the other hand, frankly, is going through some very horrendous political and security situations which are not close to reaching a conclusion as we speak. Even if I look then to Asia, which is a part of the world I know well, I lived in Japan in the early part of my career, visited Asia a lot. People talk of the 21st century as being the Asian century. It may well be. Certainly the emergence of China, but also the emergence of many of the ASEAN countries is an important phenomenon. I completely agree with the former Commissioner Chris Patton, who, when he said that the only thing that should worry us more than a successful China would be an unsuccessful China. But it is clear that this is not without its tensions in the region. The re-emergence of territorial claims disputed between Japan, China, Korea. A couple of years ago, when I used to visit the region, I used to actually lecture our Asian friends to say they should copy the European model of security architecture that we had put in place through the OSCE. Frankly, that lecture looks a little less credible today than it did 2 or 3 years ago, but those tensions have not gone away in that part of the world either, even if, fortunately, they have not yet erupted into any kind of violence, but the tensions are still there. Prime Minister Abe will be in Washington next week. He's already been meeting in Jakarta with his Chinese counterpart, and we hope that Asia can find a diplomatic and political resolution to these conflicts, but unfortunately the potential for conflict remains. So this is the global international situation in which we find ourselves, with risks and tensions in almost every part of the world. And it's very important in this, I think, the United States and the EU work together closely, but I'll come back to that in a few minutes. On the economic side, we are slowly recovering from the effects of the economic crisis. I remember Tony Blair saying that just after 9/11 that perhaps that was the real beginning of the millennium, and I certainly don't want to diminish the significance of the events of 9/11, not only and the tragedy by the many. I myself think perhaps the collapse of Lehman Brothers is close to the finding point because of the huge financial crisis which it has triggered, and frankly, speaking as a spoiled economist, the challenges which it puts to economic policy making. The United States has come through the crisis relatively well, I must say. I think the United States had, if I may say so, a better crisis than Europe did, because the United States was able to respond more effectively, more quickly, because of the organized. The European response was immediately hampered by the fact that the crisis exposed serious weaks in the architecture and the construction of the single currency and economic and monetary union. This had to be repaired. We had to prevent that member states could run their economic policies without regard to the fact that they actually had a shared currency. So this required closer budgetary coordination. We needed to put in place banking resolution, banking union, in order to make sure that we had a European-wide approach to the issue of banking solidity, which has been achieved. So it has taken us a couple of years. But very fortunately, we have turned the corner, and now I think there is good economic news out of Europe, positive growth in many parts of the EU. In fact, positive growth in every member state, stronger in some places than others, expected to be somewhere around 1.5% this year, probably 2 or maybe even higher next year. So this is the beginnings of the end of the recession in Europe. And I think there are other factors which give rise to optimism. For example, the quantitative easing intervention of the European Central Bank, which mirrors the stimulus program which the United States put in place a few years ago. Some people say it's a bit late. I would say better late than never. It took us a little while to get agreement on that kind of action, and that is now pumping extra liquidity into the system, which will give an extra boost to the already strong trends which are there. We have the depreciation of the euro, which is partly a result of the quantitative easing on behalf of the ECB, but partly a result, frankly, of the improved economic performance in the United States, which meant that the dollar has gone up. The net result is that for those of us who live and work in the United States and are paid in euros, our standard of living has gone down. But for the European economy as a whole, this is actually a positive. And this will add further to economic growth. And we then have the third factor, because normally if your currency depreciates, the disadvantage is that your imports become more expensive. Europe's biggest single import item is energy. And in fact, the price of energy, the price of oil has fallen, not just fallen, but fallen dramatically. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing in general, and I think volatility in the price of energy is not a good thing, but let's take it for what it's worth, and it does mean that it gets an additional boost from a fall in our import prices. So all of this, in my view, combines to give us good news economically, and I noted that American companies have had a record export year to Europe, and I hope that that will continue to be the case as our economy picks up. Of course, in addition, the new Juncker Commission has in place since last November, has put forward a very ambitious agenda. I want to mention 3 things in particular because I think they will be of enormous significance for the future of the European economy. Firstly, Capital Markets Union. The way in which the funding of industry works in Europe is much more heavily dependent on banks than on liquid capital markets, which you use more in the United States. And the Commission has produced a green paper recommending that Europe needs to move towards a more integrated capital market across the 28 member states, better to emulate the situation in the United States. It's a rather unusual paper. It's a green paper, first proposal. I say unusual because it's not often that a paper from the European Commission opens with the paragraph saying, here's something the United States does better than us and we need to copy them. So in that itself, it's already a breakthrough. The second proposal relates to energy union, the need to create a truly integrated energy market in Europe. Firstly, to have more efficient use of energy resources. Take, for example, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, who produce surplus quantities of electricity through renewable energy because they're well placed geographically to do that. So far, they're unable to export that energy across Europe because of the lack of an interconnector across the Pyrenees, and there was just a very important agreement signed between the Commission, Spain, Portugal, and France to build that interconnector. But that's just one example of how we can build a more integrated energy market across the European Union, which will have 2 effects. Firstly, hopefully it'll make us more efficient in our use of energy, but secondly, we want to remove the dependence of any of our member states on one particular source of energy. And clearly we have in mind there Russia, which is for a number of our member states the only source of particularly gas exports. It's not that we want to stop doing business with Russia, that we want to stop buying Russian energy. On the contrary, it will be an important part of the energy mix, but we believe that all member states should have at least 3 sources of energy so that they are never captive to a single supplier. The final area of activity, which will be announced on the 6th of May, is the creation of what we call the digital single market. As you may know, we already built in the early 90s a physical single market for goods, persons, capital movement and services. But the issue of the digital single market, the digitalization of the economy, has posed new challenges, and there are new barriers to a truly integrated digital single market in Europe, and the Commission will come forward on the 6th of May with proposals about how to put that in place. These are all, of course, medium-term projects. but they will start to make their effects felt in a few years, and within 5-10 years we hope that these 3 projects will have come to fruition and made Europe an even more competitive, efficient and effective place to do business and to trade. Of course, it's not all good news out of Europe. There are challenges, and we have to acknowledge those. I've talked a bit about the external challenges, the external environment. The sanctions we've taken against Russia have probably cut maybe 1/4 to 1/3 of a percentage point off our growth, which gives you some idea of the extent of Europe's economic links with Russia. And of course, the instability to the south poses challenges which will have economic effects. But we also have internal challenges. It is clear that one of the challenges the European Union faces at this stage of our development, having moved from the 6 original member states in the mid-50s through to 9 member states in the 70s, bringing in Greece from the totalitarianism, Spain and Portugal from their transition from totalitarianism to democracy in 1985, and of course the fantastic achievement of integrating the former Soviet bloc countries, the 10 who joined us in 2004, and enabled through European Union membership to transform themselves into modern social democratic, market-based rule of law societies. This has been a huge achievement. But it is also true that the economic crisis, the extent of the building of Europe, has also created a certain gulf, a certain disconnect between what happens in Brussels and what happens and the perceptions felt locally. It's not an unusual phenomenon even in a country as federated as the United States. I sometimes like to say that Brussels is held in just about as much respect by the rest of Europe as Washington is by the rest of the United States. The federal level is not always loved and appreciated by the regional or the national, or in your case, the state level. And yet we do need to make these things function and coexist. But it is clear that in many cases also the economic austerity which we have gone through has given rise to populist parties, a certain xenophobia, racism, even the rise of anti-Semitism. These are very serious challenges that we have to address in a very deep and profound way, and the centre is pushing back, but we have to acknowledge that these challenges are there and they're going to be tested in many elections which are going to be taking place. We've seen what has happened in Greece, where a government was elected basically rejecting the policies of the previous government, and the challenge we're having of finding a way forward with Greece. I believe we will find that way forward because nobody wants Greece to leave the Eurozone, nobody wants Greece to leave the European Union, neither do the Greeks. But we have to find an accommodation with this new government, which is a new government, and try to find its own way of reconciling the objective of full membership of the European Union, full membership of the Eurozone, and full respect of its international commitments with the electoral commitments it gave to its people about reducing the effects of austerity. And squaring that circle is not going to be easy either for Greece or for the European Union, but I believe we will find a way forward. But there will be other tests. We have a very interesting upcoming election in the United Kingdom on the 7th of May. We will have elections in Spain. We will have elections in the coming years in many other countries across Europe. And there is going to be a debate about how much Europe people want, how much integration, to what extent integration is a good thing or a bad thing. And this debate is going to have to be carried on rigorously across Europe. We also have the issue of the aging population of Europe. We face a major demographic challenge in the coming years. And one of the major answers to that, of course, would be immigration. But as we know, immigration is precisely one of the most politically sensitive issues domestically in all our member states at the present time. And of course, I could not touch on that without talking about the latest horrific incidents in the Mediterranean Sea, with the death of, we don't know precisely how many people, there's speculation it may be as many as 900, of a tragic accident of a boat carrying illegal immigrants crashing into a vessel that was actually trying to help and try to provide support for these people, resulting in several hundred people as far as we know. This has come as a huge shock to the system. It raises very serious challenges for us. I mean, I want to be very clear that the primary responsibility in all of this, of course, goes with the traffickers. I mean, let us be frank, what we are witnessing here is the ruthless exploitation of the misery of people trying to find their way to a better way of life across the Mediterranean Sea, being exploited by traffickers who are putting them in unseaworthy vessels and basically just pushing them out to sea and saying, you know, go in that direction and see what happens. And of course, unfortunately, inevitably, some of these people never make it. And this is a humanitarian, in the first instance, a humanitarian tragedy which requires an urgent response and action. The European foreign ministers discussed this issue on Monday and have already come up with a number of suggestions, and the situation is considered so serious that the heads of state and government, the European Council, will meet tomorrow to take forward the discussion. It's clear we need to act on many levels. We need to act first and foremost on the humanitarian level, in the sea, to try and rescue as many people as possible, or to make sure that people are not drowning in crossing. We need to address the issue of the traffickers and their facilitation. We are even contemplating using military means to do that. We already play a leading role in the naval mission Atalanta off the coast of Somalia, which is an anti-piracy mission which has been in place for several years and which has very successfully reduced almost to zero pirate activity on ships in that area. And some of the experiences there could perhaps be borrowed to help stop the work of the traffickers, undermine their ability to put people into leaky boats and so forth. We need to try and find a political solution in Libya, because part of the problem is the breakdown of the rule of law in Libya and the ability of the authorities actually to act as an effective stop on the transit of migrants coming from lower down in Africa. And we need to look at the development agenda to try and make sure that these people coming from countries who feel in a state of desperation with no economic future can build a better economic future for themselves at home. But we will also honestly need to accept that there will be a continuous stream of migrants into Europe. Some of these will be asylum seekers and have to be dealt with under the international obligations which we have. Others will be illegal immigrants, and we will have to see how we deal with those, treating them humanely, but also trying to make sure that some of them go back to the places from which they came. And this is going to require much more European solidarity than we've seen at the present time. To be very frank, the Italian government has made huge efforts over the last 18 months or so and has saved probably 100,000 people from drowning at great expense to the Italian taxpayer and with great generosity of spirit of the people of Italy who have welcomed these people on land. But we cannot expect Italy or Malta or Greece, who are in the front line of this, to handle this alone. And I think one of the positive outcomes of this unfortunate tragedy hopefully will be a greater willingness on the part of other member states also to offer refuge and asylum to more of these immigrants who legitimately must be taken and welcomed into Europe, even if it is clear that we cannot have a completely open gate policy on immigration because we would not be able to absorb the potential numbers which would be involved. So finding a solution to this problem will be an important challenge. It is clear that in all of this, the United States and the European Union are very close allies. We work very closely together on a number of issues. I've already mentioned sanctions, where we have maintained not just European unity but transatlantic unity, and of course Iran, where it is the European sanctions that I think have probably been the important element in changing the dynamic of the situation and bringing Iran to the table in order to try and create the deal which is now partially done on making it impossible for Iran, I beg your pardon, to acquire military nuclear capabilities. This is a very complex negotiation. I know it's a very controversial one here in the United States, but the European Union is actually chairing these talks in the form of High Representative Federica Mogherini, who will be in Washington next week once again. And we are very strong supporters of this diplomatic avenue to find a solution once and for all to put military nuclear weapons definitively beyond use for Iran, because we believe this is the best way forward, and we think the agreements reached so far provide a strong platform. We know we have to go further and actually finalize this into a formal agreement, including on the issue of the synchronization and the timing of the lifting of sanctions, which remains a point of contention. But it's been several years in the making, but frankly this agreement could be one of the most significant international diplomatic achievements of recent years, and we strongly support the work and strongly support the American position and have worked closely with them. We also work, of course, very closely on other issues, the Middle East. We cooperate in Africa. And there are areas where we maybe sometimes have some nuances. I could mention the area of climate change, where I think the EU has been really a leader in taking forward the importance of addressing the issue of climate change. It's an issue of planetary importance, and we believe very strongly that we need a good agreement in Paris at the end of the year. I think the United States and EU are now much more on the same page after the recent policies announced by President Obama than we were a few years ago, and I hope that we can be strong allies going into the agreement in Paris and produce a good agreement in Paris, which can be a platform for global action against climate change. It's clear that the developed world will have to take some of the most ambitious action, but we also will have to persuade the emerging developing countries, who potentially could become some of the biggest polluters if they do not adopt progressive and climate-friendly policies from the very beginning. They must also make their contribution, and we will be working in that direction towards Paris. The other area where, of course, we have some disagreements is in the issue of data privacy, following the revelations of the Snowden leaks, and the whole question of internet regulation and internet governance. We've had some controversy over the decision to pursue an antitrust case with Google. I'd just like to be very clear about this. I think the European antitrust competition authorities are among the most respected in the world, by the way, as are the American Fair Trade Commission. I think we're known for our objectivity and for the fact that this is never a political process. It is a purely objective, legally based and economic reasoning based approach. We've been examining the case against Google for a number of years. It has finally been decided that, notwithstanding some of the contacts which were had with Google about a possible settlement, that in the end we had to present a formal statement of objections. This is a first phase in a process. Google will have the right to reply, to make their own case, and then the Commission will decide if there is a solution, or if Google has broken the law in a way that would require a fine. If there is a fine, Google has absolutely the right to go to court to contest that, and by the way, we have on occasions been overturned by the court. So this is an entirely substance-driven issue. I note that in America, the Fair Trade Commission appears to have had a similar debate about whether Google was fully in compliance with antitrust law, and in the end decided not to pursue the case, and we fully respect that, and I'm sure that was based on their objective analysis of the facts. But the European regulators have their own responsibilities, and we have made the choice we have made, but I want to emphasize this is not a protectionist measure, this is not an US internet company measure, and indeed, not that I'm going to link the two things, we just announced yesterday that we're pursuing a case against Gazprom for its behavior on the gas market in Europe, which has also been under investigation for some time. And we have also prosecuted on many occasions European companies for similar breaches of antitrust. So I think that these issues have to be seen in the right context. They will inevitably be problems. By the way, we had situations where European companies were fined by the Treasury for breach of US sanctions which were not legally obliging on European companies through European law, but we understood that when European companies get caught breaking the US law, they will be fined. If US companies are caught breaking EU law, the same conclusion must be drawn. In all of this, of course, we are engaged in a very important negotiation with the United States for a future very ambitious trade agreement called the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. This, I think, offers huge economic opportunities. I've been able to see, while here in Georgia and Atlanta, the extent of European investment in this particular state, but this is true generally. 70% of foreign direct investment in the United States comes from Europe. American companies are heavily invested in Europe. We create collectively nearly 15 million jobs across the Transatlantic corridor. The Transatlantic corridor remains the most important economic corridor in the world, bar none. We talk about Asia, and I'm a great fan of Asia, as I've said, and I wish Asia well and successful, and it will grow and become economically more significant. The fact is, American companies make more money out of their investments in Belgium than they do out of their investments in China. And the same is true for Europe. Even though we invest in China, we make much more money out of our investments in the United States. So we should not forget that collectively we represent 30 to 40% of global trade, of global GDP, and a successful trade agreement between us would boost economic activity on both sides of the Atlantic and would provide us with the opportunity going forward to agree, hopefully, standards, transatlantic standards for new products and services which are not yet even on the market, which would have de facto become the global standard. And that offers a huge opportunity for us to influence the future growth and direction of economic activity in the 21st century. Because, and this is what I would like to end on, the 21st century, to a certain extent, is going to be a debate about which model of development works best. We in Europe and in the United States believe that a model which is based on democracy, which is based on the rule of law, which is based on values, which is based on human rights, actually offers, which is based on the market economy, actually offers the best perspective for prosperity, for freedom, and ultimately, as your declaration says, happiness. There are many people who claim, no, this is not the model that can work. This can't work in large countries. It can't work in China. It can't be made to work in some Arab countries. It can't be made to work in Russia. And there are alternative models, models of benign dictatorship, models of managed democracy, as some people like to call the situation in Russia, models of China, where you still have single-party rule. If we are to persuade and win this battle in the 21st century, we need to work very closely together. And we share huge values. We have a common understanding. As Vice President Biden said at the Munich Security Conference recently, we are each other's best friend of first resort. And we need to work very closely together and have a strong alliance if we are going to have our model prevail as the predominant value and ethos of the 21st century. And I think that this is hugely important. I was very struck when I arrived here. One of the privileges you get is to present your credentials to the President of the United States. It's quite amazing that such a busy man finds time to meet individually every ambassador from probably, I don't know, the 130, 140 countries that are accredited in Washington. And you're supposed to write something in the guest book of the White House. I don't know whoever reads this afterwards, by the way, but I was looking for something to write, and I was struck by a speech given by President Obama in which he said the United States was predicated on the assumption that we can build a better history. And this is very true. This country was founded on people coming, mostly from Europe at that time, unhappy with the system of governance in Europe and hoping to build a better society in the United States, which you did with the remarkable democracy and vibrant human rights and liberty, which was installed here much earlier than it was later to come to Europe, even if many of the ideas which came here were European. But I would also like to say that, and in the book, is that the European Union is also predicated on the assumption that we can build a better history. The European Union was Europe's way of doing things differently in the 21st century than we had tragically done in the 20th century, two wars producing all the horrors we knew, including the Holocaust. And I think that has been the great achievement of the European Union, has been to make the notion of war between European countries impossible and to build a more integrated and a more harmonious and a more stable Europe. And I believe that both the United States and the European Union, based on those values, can try to make that contribution to the global evolution in the 21st century. This will be your century. You're the people who are going to inhabit and shape this century. I don't know what you think of the world that, you know, people like myself have left for you. My daughter keeps saying, you know, Dad, you've made such a mess of things. You know, I don't know how our generation is going to clean it all up. I don't think we've made a mess, but I think we've achieved many things. But it's true that it's a constant challenge. It's a constant challenge. Every day you get up, you still have to push that rock up the hill of trying to achieve international peace, prosperity, understanding, avoiding of conflict, respect of the rule of law. And I hope that your generation will feel the same commitment to that, both within the United States, within Europe, and playing our role globally and internationally, because that's what we desperately need if the 21st century is to be a happier place than was the 20th. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for that wide-ranging talk about the importance, well, the challenges that the world faces, but also the importance of the transatlantic relationship in addressing them. We have a few minutes before people have to leave for class for questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to take questions in clusters. There is a microphone coming around, so please stand up if you would like to ask a question, and then we can find you.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. O Sullivan, for coming here today. My name is Yvonne Plotter. I'm a fourth year studying international affairs in French. So my question to you, you ended on a really wonderful note, and I was reflecting on some previous conversations that I had, and increasingly we're seeing that European countries are decreasing their funding for NATO, while the US is actually increasing. And I was wondering if you could shed light on the European Union's conversations around this, and how does this really influence the dynamic of NATO and the European Union? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Sullivan, for being here. My question is in regards to global crises that you mentioned, the breakdown of the war in Libya, the rise and emergence of ISIL Daesh, and among others that you mentioned. Where do you think the EU will be most successful in helping to alleviate the crisis?
One more. Oh, there's one up there. Looks like there's one up in the. I can't see very much.
Thank you. So I'll just go to my question directly. I know that you mentioned Yemen a bit right here. You mentioned Yemen, and I'd like to know what European Union's sort of stance is on, just invasion of the country, not only by Saudi Arabia, but I see international trends of getting into the country. So I'd like to know European Union stance. And I know that you mentioned growing anti-Semitism in European Union and countries founded under the framework. I'd like to know how you look at the growing Islamophobia in the region too. Thank you.
I think that's enough to start with.
Yeah, okay. On the question of NATO, well, I think this is a very important question. Ireland is not part of NATO. I'm Irish and we're neutral, and as I always like to say, quoting an Irish Prime Minister, we're neutral, but we just haven't decided who we're neutral against. But I think the issue of whether Europe is spending enough money in order to be able to ensure its own security is an important discussion we have to have with our population. You will understand, and I think it is important to understand this, that after the horrors of the two wars, military expenditure was not the most popular item in Europe. And I come, I must say, from a generation, and I come from a military family. My father was in the Irish Army. I also instinctively, spending money on guns and missiles and tanks rather than on education and healthcare, I mean, it doesn't sit comfortably. On the other hand, I'm profoundly convinced that my father used to say, every country has an army. You have your own army or you have someone else's army. I'm profoundly convinced that Europe has to have the capacity to respond to risks of attack eventually, but also some capacity to intervene in situations where military force, unfortunately and tragically, is needed, whether in support of the United Nations or as we did in the Balkans, as part of NATO, as we did in Afghanistan. So I think that discussion has to be had with the European population, but I will not hide from you, it's a very difficult sell politically at a time of high austerity with cutbacks in education and healthcare to say to people, well, by the way, at the same time we need to spend more money to buy aircraft carriers and other weapons. But we need to have that discussion. The European Council in June will return to the issue of European defense cooperation. Next week in Washington, we're holding a seminar precisely on European cooperation in security and defense. We do have joint military missions, mainly in Africa at this point, European, EU-led missions. We would like much closer cooperation with NATO. There are structural problems mainly linked to the issue of Cyprus and continued Turkish occupation of northern Cyprus and the tensions which revolve around that, which have made it difficult to have the kind of cooperation that both the EU and NATO would like to have. But the general message from the United States that we cannot expect the United States to be the sole provider of security in the European theater has, I think, been understood by policymakers. I'm not yet sure that it has sunk into popular consciousness in the way that it perhaps needs to. On the question of Libya, Daesh, Yemen, which problem can we make the greatest contribution to solving? I think one of the first things we have to understand about international diplomacy, and many of you are studying international relations, sometimes you can't fix a problem. Sometimes a problem has to work itself out. If a country decides to have a civil war, sometimes you just have to allow that civil war to play out and then see what happens at the end of it. The international community, and I believe profoundly in the responsibility to protect, in the responsibility to intervene, where possible to prevent slaughter or genocide or ethnic cleansing, but sometimes you can't intervene everywhere and solve every problem. And I don't know what the solution in Libya is. We are very supportive of the efforts of Bernardino Leon, a former Spanish diplomat who is now the UN Special Representative, to try and put together a political solution in Libya. The answer is we should get a political dialogue going between the parties and get them around the table to form a new government. The same in Yemen. But whether we will succeed, frankly, I don't know. Because if people really want to fight with each other, sometimes that's what's going to happen. And you have to try and just deal with the consequences afterwards. So we will continue to invest heavily in Libya. We are part of the coalition against Daesh. We're part of many European countries are participating in the attempts to push back ISIS. But again, this is also, and then I come to the point about Islamophobia, this is to a certain extent an intra-Islamic debate between Sunni and Shiite. And there are many more Muslims being killed through terrorism than there are Europeans or Americans. I include fully Islamophobia with my dislike of xenophobia. I mentioned anti-Semitism specifically because, of course, it has a particular resonance, and I was just recently at the Holocaust Museum for the commemoration, and we have a particular European responsibility in the issue of the Holocaust. But Islamophobia is absolutely not the answer. We absolutely must not be allowed by the terrorists to have the kind of reflex they would like, which is to turn this into a clash between our Muslim citizens or the Muslim world and the West. That's absolutely not the issue. We have full respect for the Islamic religion, for Muslim people, including those who are citizens or living on European territory, and they are entitled to their full rights as citizens, and we must utterly reject any form of racism or Islamophobia, just as we do that for anti-Semitism or for any other form of racial hatred, which is completely anathema to the values on which Europe is built.
I think we have time for two really quick questions. There's a limited time offer. Is that a question that's hard to see? I think there's one back there. There are a couple in the back. Where's the microphone going? Well, maybe you can shout.
Sorry, what was the last part of that?
Cyprus.
Cyprus.
And then last question.
Yeah, you touched on it a little bit. Can you speak a little bit further on the quantitative easing program of the EU and the relation it will play to the strength of the euro?
In relation to the
Euro, strength of the euro.
Okay. Well, firstly, we take U.S. policy, as it is now on climate change, and we are very much on the same page. I think we recognize the importance of the issue. I know there are climate change deniers out there. There are people who think the world is flat, but I think that the facts are what they are, and this is a hugely important issue. I spent time in the Pacific. There are Pacific islands just disappearing daily, and populations being displaced. Climate change is a reality. By the way, you see it in this country. Look at what's happening in California. Look at the extreme weather which we're experiencing. I mean, these things are happening, and we know that there is a strong contribution of mankind or humankind to that. It may not be the only factor. It may be accumulation of many factors, and so frankly, everyone in the world accepts it. China, India, they all accept the reality of climate change. They just think that they blame us for it more than they blame themselves. And they're right. Historically, the developed world created more of the human activity which caused climate change than they have. The problem is they will be the ones who will bear even worse, even more than we do, the consequences if this is not fixed. And they risk to become part of the problem, and they therefore also have to become part of the solution. So I'm quite sure the center of gravity of U.S. thinking on climate change is going to remain pretty much where it is now, because of the sense that also public opinion in the United States has shifted on this issue in ways which were a few years ago. On the question of Russia, look, we want good relations with Russia. All our policy of the last 20 years was trying to bring Russia into the international community, whether into the WTO. We were investing actually quite large sums of money in helping Russia modernize its economy. We continue to want to have good relations with Russia, but they're going to have to stop doing what they are doing in their immediate neighborhood before that can happen. As Federica Mogherini, the High Representative, said, we used to have a strategic partnership with Russia. Russia has decided that it is no longer our partner. Russia has decided it is no longer our partner. And that's what we have to try and fix, and we will work in that direction, but we will not compromise our principles about the unacceptability of the annexation of Crimea or the unacceptability of the destabilization of Russia in eastern Ukraine. In terms of the relationship with individual member states, of course, Russia continues to exist. Russia continues to have relations, sometimes closer with some member states than with others, but I do not believe that there is any such a strong link between Russia financially and any of our member states that this would become the determining factor in the relationship, to speak plainly, I hope. On the question of quantitative easing and the euro, look, quantitative easing was necessary because we had to put more liquidity into the system and give some stimulus in a situation where we were at risk, perhaps, of approaching deflation. We did not have deflation in Europe, we have not had it, but the fear was there that the inflation was insufficiently low. The responsibility of the European Central Bank is to ensure inflation not greater than 2%. Inflation at the moment is way below that, and therefore it was decided it was necessary, rather as you had a stimulus program here, to inject money into the system to try and stimulate more economic activity and to build up to get the rate of inflation closer to where it needs to be. It did not have as the objective the devaluation of the euro. Look, the euro is a currency. Currencies go up and they go down. When the euro was first launched, it was at parity with the dollar, slightly above. Then it went below, then it came back to parity, then it went up again. For the last 3 or 4 years, while the US was practicing monetary stimulus, the dollar was down and the euro was up. We did not complain excessively about that. Now it's the other way around. The US economy is performing more strongly than ours, therefore the dollar is more valuable. We're now practicing quantitative easing, which is the same as stimulus, and the euro is going down. It will come back up because you already are seeing the effects that the high dollar is slowing down your economic activity, the low euro is increasing our economic activity, and at some point these will converge. We live in a world of floating exchange rates. What counts is that we allow our currencies to be freely traded and that the value is determined by the marketplace and by the assessment of the market about the relative economic performance. That's the reality. I think the euro will continue to be a relatively strong currency going forward, but like any currency, it will have its highs and its lows. I just wish that it didn't have its lows when I'm living in the United States, but that seems to be what I'm condemned to endure. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking the ambassador for a very interesting and wide-ranging speech. I would caution those of you who aspire to be ambassadors, pay attention to the range of issues on which he was expected to have an informed opinion. Right? It's not an easy job. So thank you very much for coming and sharing.